Hi, people. So, the first part of this topic on public transport in the UK, I was focusing on trains and transit systems around the country. I use the Tyne Metro as an example. Um, so, in this section, I'll be looking at buses, taxis, ships, and planes, none of which I've used extensively, but it's worth commenting a little bit on them. I'm sure there's other forms of transport as well, but for the purpose of these videos, I'll stick to those. I do mostly, when I've used public transport, it's mostly been trains or the local transit system, so it makes sense that the first half is dominated by that. Now, I think with buses, there's overlap with trains, and I'll be honest from the outset, I'm not a huge fan of bus travel or bus or taxi travel. Of course, with buses, you get national coaches, which can be very comfortable and very cheap. The only thing with those, my only grievance with those, I guess, is that sometimes drivers leave a few minutes early. So I think that's a little unfair. If there's a scheduled time, they should leave at that time. And I know they're trying to save fuel or something, but in theory, if a customer, you know, no, if the leaving departure time is say 9 a.m., it should be 9 a.m. It shouldn't be 5 to 9. Because let's say someone's running, well, not even running late, but they get there just on time, then they're penalised. They miss the journey. Now, really, they should be there earlier. That's just practical. But that's one thing about the coaches. Sometimes they do leave a little bit early. And I think that's unfair. If someone's paid, even if it's a very small amount, if they miss their coach, they then have to schedule another trip. I think the departure time should be the departure time, not early, not late. It should be that time. Maybe people might think I'm pedantic about that, but this all comes down to information for the customer. Now, the customer's responsibility is to be there on time, obviously. Um, But in terms of local bus services, here around the northeast, we have buses that are designed, and this is something I like actually. It's something I think is quite quirky. They get designs like Blackberry, Graphite. What are the others? Fox. Sorry, the Silver Fox is one. They've all these cool designs, and I I don't use those buses often, but I think it gives a kind of unique flavour to them, and they look good. They look much better than the regular Go Northeast or Stagecoach buses. Um, and if you don't use buses often, it's a good way to mark them out. Okay, well, if you get the Silver Fox bus or the Blackberry bus, and that brings you to this place. Um, I think bus travel's all very well if you know what the set tariff is and you know exactly the routes. But the problem is if you don't take buses regularly, a bus timetable can be quite complex. It can take a while to adapt to that. Because I walk most places, I use buses rarely. I think if I was using them more often, it would probably be when I got my COVID jab. I went to Nightingale Hospital, but they were special bus services put on. It's just one of those things, it's about adapting to it. Um, Taxis, same thing. There's some people that use them all the time. I prefer to avoid taxis because they're expensive. And the thing is, let's talk about the elephant in the room. There is an issue with reputation of certain drivers, and this is also true of bus drivers that just have an attitude problem to customers. It works both ways. I know these people have to put up with drunks and they have to put up with some very unpleasant fares, and they have huge sympathy. That's not a fun thing to do. But I had an experience once where I was in a rural area. It was in Shropshire, actually. No, excuse me, Surrey. It was Surrey on that occasion. And basically, I'd been to do with my brother, and frankly, I was a little bit drunk. So I was in no state to walk back or to try and find my own way back. So he got me on a taxi. He gave the correct fare. Um, but basically, the taxi driver left me off in this lane that wasn't quite at the final point. It wasn't at the hotel I was staying at. In fact, there was a long country lane leading down from the hotel. Now, this guy couldn't be bothered to drive the whole way up, and I was basically lost. So I somehow managed to stumble my way back, but I was not happy about that. And it wasn't that I didn't have the full fare. It's just that I think he thought it was a one way system and he couldn't get back. But I thought that was a bit irresponsible to leave. I mean, frankly, I was vulnerable. I was drunk in that situation, and I'm all one for self responsibility and all of that. But I think if you're paying for a service, I'd make this analogy: if you go into a restaurant, you order the main course and you order dessert, and the waiter brings you the main course, but they don't bring the dessert, yet they charge the full price, or the restaurant charges the full price. You'd have issue with that because you think, well, where's the dessert? Well, it was the same principle here. I paid for the whole journey, but I didn't get the whole journey. And I am not the sort of person to be a kind of obnoxious drunk. It was nothing like that. I was just kind of dozing it off. So that wasn't good, and it's things like that that gives taxi drivers sometimes a negative reputation. But it's like any profession; you can't generalize. There's also taxi drivers out there that will go out of their way for people. I remember the sitcom Cold Feet. Now, if anyone watched that show, there was an early episode where the characters, if you know the show well, the character Adam had just been diagnosed with cancer, and he was distracted and he said home, and the taxi driver, played by Ricky Tomlinson, said, well, unless you mean my home, son, you're going to have to give me an address. But basically the thing is, he gave him a free fare, because he'd already had a blow, and it was kind of a little decent act of humanity. But then his friend got on and he said, put the tariff on me, I know how dodgy you taxi drivers are. The point here being is that it really, really does come down to individual experience. I think there are some taxi drivers out there who are a bit unscrupulous, and they will try and get more money by tricking people. I mean, I've had a friend who was overcharged from what the standard rate would have been from Heathrow Airport to central London. Now, that's a big journey. You'd expect that to be costly, but I looked it up, and I looked up what the standard fare should be, and the guy charged her a lot more because her English wasn't great. And I do think there's situations where certain people will take advantage of that, not just in this country; it happens elsewhere as well. I guess human nature, but it varies. Same with bus drivers. I've had bus drivers, who really just have an attitude problem. You ask, well, how much is the fare? And they give you a funny look, like you should already know. But if you don't use buses regularly, how else are you meant to know other than asking the driver? So really, really varies. To me, I really believe this strongly. If you're in any form of public service, whether you're a waiter or working in a bank or working in a shop or a taxi driver or a bus driver or whatever else, you should have a certain level of approachability. I'm not saying you should put on some big show and a big fake smile, but just be approachable. Don't be such a miserable git, because that that is polarizing. When someone needs help, they might, and you're not approachable. It doesn't. It's not. I don't think it gives a company a good image, um, and I don't think that's too much to ask. Certainly, whenever I've worked in shops, I've always been made myself, approachable to customers. I think it's the same principle. Um, let's see. So yeah, I try to avoid taxis and buses when I can. But again, it's one of those things. If you're more used to them, then they're probably like it's just a standard thing. I do remember though a while back there was a bus driver that left a young woman, well, a teenage girl, alone at night. She was running to catch the bus, and this bugger closed the door on her. Disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. And he came up with some pedantic rule. Oh, she wasn't behind the white line, but this was late at night, teenage girl on her own. It was, and the company got a lot of heat for that. I'm pleased to say. I do think there are some jobs worths out there who will not, use common sense, and there is such a thing as playing by the book too much. It's one thing if it's for safety reasons, but leaving a young woman on her own like that, disgrace. Um, but on that occasion, the company did apologise. But that sort of thing should not be happening. So training should really, really come into that. And I think drivers, whether taxi drivers or bus drivers, should be trained to use common sense. To be fair, a lot of them probably do, but that was an occasion of computer says no, and you have a teenage girl on her own at night time. It just not good. And I mean a young teenager. I think she was 13 or 14. Um, So let's see, buses, taxis, Uber. Can't say anything about it simply because I haven't used it. So, you know, next question. Yeah, I just can't say enough about that because I haven't used it. I know there's a long running feud between Ubers and taxis, but I'm really not placed to say too much about that. What else can I say? Um, Ships. Well, I've used a P&O crossing from Scotland to Northern Ireland. There isn't really much to say about that. My father much prefers ships and trains to planes. I don't mind ships. I remember once when I was a kid, I had a glass of milk, big mistake, and when I went over in the P&O ferry crossing between Northern Ireland and Scotland, and I was really, really sick. Just the swaying waves and that milk. I could not drink milk for years afterwards. And that water can be quite rough. There was a Victoria disaster in 1953, one of our worst peacetime maritime disasters. It happened in that body of water. Um, and then, of course, the Herald of Free Enterprise in 1987, which was the very day my sister in law was born, because the doors hadn't been put down properly. There was other safety factors involved in that. I don't mind ship travel. I just haven't really had enough experience to comment in great detail. One thing I will say, though, is there's some ethical issues with the entire shipping industry in terms of how they treat some of their staff. I think sometimes it's like the law of the sea and you get independent contractors. I do think sometimes you get, for example, staff from Eastern Europe or other parts of the world and they're not entirely treated well. That's my gut feeling. You know, I don't have like evidence to say this is exactly what happened, but I do think the industry, like some other hospitality industries, it's got a bit of a reputation for not entirely treating its staff well. Um, Other than that, though, I can't say a great deal about those services. I know that my parents done a luxury cruise recently. This is kind of going beyond the domain of the UK. They went in Fred Olsen, and apparently it was very luxurious, except that the food's included, but you have to pay extra for the drinks. So I think with maritime services, there's always hidden costs. There's always extra costs somewhere. That's one thing to bear in mind. That brings me to flight to planes. Again, this is kind of going beyond the UK because, to be fair, aviation, it's going between countries. So it's not solely the domain of one country, unless we're talking about particular companies. So I went to Berlin Brandenburg recently. It's a big new airport, opened in 2020. Berlin used to have smaller airports, but anyway, um, it was pretty smooth travels. I had no big problems. There was a long check-in on the way back, but anyway, that's that side. And this isn't an analysis of Berlin Brandenburg. Newcastle International. I think it's a good airport. In fact, it was named as one of the best airports of its size in Europe, and I can see why. It's well marked. It's easy to find your way around. I give Newcastle Airport high points. I think it's a good airport. Um, I've been in quite a few airports in my life, and it's one of the best. It's not a massive airport. It's what I would call a medium-sized airport. So it's not local. It is an international airport, but it's a small international airport. Handles about 5 million passengers a year. So, just by contrast, Heathrow handles 63 million a year. That's been rebounded since the pandemic. And then a small regional airport might be 500,000 or usually under a million. So Newcastle's kind of lower medium sized international airport. But no problems. And the morning I was traveling, I left early because I thought the snow would affect the metro service. But luckily, it was running there. And one of the good things, the metro goes straight to the airport. So, all positive. That was all good. I like plane travel. Some people are scared of flying. And this might sound like a cliche, but it really, really is the safest form of transport. I mean, this year, 2023, as I make it, there has been one major civilian aviation disaster in the world. That was a flight over Nepal back at the beginning of the year, where sadly 72 people perished. But, compare that to the 70s, 80s, even the 90s. There was disasters like that at least once a month, at least, maybe more. So aviation has hugely, hugely improved. That's why, on takeoff, even though there was heavy turbulence and the wings were going, I really wasn't nervous. I like flying. I like the feeling of flying. Airports can be stressful. Now, like I say, Newcastle's quite, it's not a huge airport. The only thing is, I will say this, but this is true of every airport. There's some contradictions. For example, when you go for the security section, they get rid of all the liquids, right? And this goes back to that transatlantic plot, I believe it was Operation Bojinka, the failed Al Qaeda plot of 2006, where I believe liquids had somehow been involved. But it's kind of contradictory because you have to get rid of all the liquids before the security section, and yet you go through and you can go to the off license, or not the off license, it's duty free, and you can buy liquids there. So it kind of defeats the purpose. Um, I think that's just a way of the airport making more money because those stores after the duty free they're all pricey, all luxury goods. But yeah, that's a catch. Well, one bit is not much fun. Is the section where you have to take all your stuff off. And at Berlin, I took my belt off. No, I asked one guy, "Shall I do my belt?" And he said no. I went, and then the other guy said, "Yeah, do your belt." So I mean, I'm a young man. I think that can be particularly stressful for older people, who are slower naturally. And I totally appreciate it's an essential part of security. I've no issues with it, but it can feel a little bit like cattle. It can feel like you're being, that side. I can understand why people don't like that. Although Berlin, they had this kind of little polar bear mascot, and it showed the polar bear removing all the stuff. And there was an Irish lady beside me and her daughter, and she was sort of showing her daughter, oh, even the polar bear can get through. She was sort of lightening the mood. But yeah, that's a bit I don't think anyone enjoys. But unfortunately, terrorism has made it essential. Um, I mean, ironically, in the 70s, there was more hijackings, but that tended to be for ransom. Sadly, since 9/11, it's been a very different story. Um, but it's essential. But with flying, again, it's information. When a flight is delayed, passengers need information. Airports. Well, one thing I don't understand in airports is when you're buying a product, why you have to show your passport. I had to do this at Amsterdam Schiphol. I guess it's for security reasons, just to know that it's just an extra measure. I guess because if you're going to the duty free, then you've got past the security section. I guess it's just an extra measure. It seems a bit silly to have to show your passport to buy a newspaper. But anyway, that's the way it is. Um, I've had a few issues on flights. I've had stuff damaged. That's one thing. I think baggage handlers can be a bit cavalier. Now I understand they're going against a time frame. They need to get the bags on by a certain time. But in the end of the day, it's someone else's property. And I know there was. I remember reading a story at Manchester International where this lady's bags were seriously damaged, and no one took responsibility. The airport said it wasn't their thing because it was private contractors. The airlines blamed the airport, and it was just passing the buck. To me, baggage handlers, they need to work quickly, but in such a way that they're not literally damaging other people's property. I understand they have to move it quickly, but I think they can do that without literally trashing things. I felt really bad for this Malian guy. He was a West African musician. He had this really unique instrument, and at one of the American airports, it basically took it apart. I guess they assumed drugs were inside. No, there wasn't. Now, that was something that was irreplaceable. I think in the end they offered some compensation, but I felt awful for the guy. That's a horrible thing. So I think yes, security is extremely important, but when they do mess up, I think they need to show a bit of humility and really understand that that's hurtful to people. If they've damaged someone's sentimental property, that's it shouldn't just be blasé, like all these things happen. They should, definitely show that they care. Because in the end of the day, it comes down to customer service. I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I like aviation. Actually, I like flying. Some people don't. Some people find airports stressful. I don't really actually. I find okay, it's A, B, C, D. Even big airports, I've not had major problems. The last time I was in China, the flight was cancelled, the local flight from Shanghai to Guilin due to storms. These things happen. Well, that was kind of long. I had to go to a hotel in Shanghai, and again, it's getting information. But it was all free. And sometimes I find if I'm traveling, if I'm not meeting anyone, it's entirely my own thing. I feel less pressure if things go wrong. But when you're meeting up with someone, then you feel more pressure because you have to keep them informed, and then it puts them out. And that's the thing with travel. If I'm solely traveling by myself, delays, well, it's not fun. But if you have a good book, it's not the end of the world. Facilities are very, very important. Most of the airports I've been in have been quite good. Dusseldorf was a good airport. They had, eateries, they had kiosks, and it's not a massive airport. They had a single concourse. Bigger airports, there's different sections, different terminals. But overall, I don't mind flying. I like it. I like planes. I like the feeling of flying. Uh, I'd even go so far to say I love it. I look forward to it. It's a big part of the holiday for me. So that's why when I went to Berlin, I was looking forward to it. I had an internal flight Dusseldorf to Berlin. It was like over in an eye blink, 50 minutes. The companies who use Eurowings, that was one thing I didn't like. Um, it used to be low cost airlines would give you a little snack or something on. Now they don't do that. Okay, fair enough. It's a short haul flight, but if you want to buy something, they only accept card. They won't even accept cash now, which I think is a bit ridiculous. So if I was giving Eurowings feedback, I would say, yeah, that's something, it's not very convenient for customers. Card only, really? Um, I guess it's to do with the pandemic and all of that. But, it's again just an assumption everyone pays by card or everyone uses the app on their phone. Not necessarily so. I think they should give people the options. Um, But overall, my favourite form of transport, if someone was to ask that, probably flying actually. I think trains in Britain can be stressful. Buses and taxis I don't use enough to say too much about, except I don't really like them. And I walk a lot. I used to cycle until my bicycle was stolen. With that being said, I hope I've given a balanced account here. I hope it hasn't been too negative. I've tried to include some positive. Let me know your thoughts about transport in the UK. Newcastle Airport, I think, is good. I think we're lucky to have the Tyne and Wear Metro, although sometimes their communication with the public can be better. Um, and yeah, the railway system is too expensive and too unreliable. One more thing I didn't say before: I think railway executives are far too overpaid. Now I know these are private companies, but to me, it's unacceptable that a regional director of equal opportunities gets paid more than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. That's obscene. Um, like 400,000 plus for what? For ticking boxes. I mean, I do think there's fat cats in the railway industry, but I also think some of the unions are. This is maybe for another issue, but it obviously comes into this. I do think wildcat strikes. Let's just strike, especially over Christmas. I think that's where unions are wrong. I believe in the principle of it, but why Christmas? Why the busiest time of the year? Why not do it off peak when you're less likely to polarize the public? That's where I have an issue with it. I think people have a right to, petition if they really feel they're being treated unfairly, but strikes during Christmas? No. I think that's very unreasonable. And I think some of these union bosses don't give a damn how much the public's inconvenienced. But that's the sort of thing that polarizes people. That's why it's essential that the government, railway companies, and these unions get some sort of compromise, because it's the public that pays the price. Okay, let me know your thoughts. We're never ever going to have a perfect system across the board, but there are some things that can improve. Here in Sunderland, we've got a brand new train station. I haven't used it yet. I might make a review of that next time I do. Thanks for watching if you've watched this far, and do let me know what the public transport situation is in your city, your county, your town. Let me know. Thanks for watching.